Rumours are circling about a potential Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time remake, and while nothing is for certain, if an Ocarina remake were to be in development, who would actually be making it? Let's take a careful look. First of all, I will say that I do give these rumours credence. In fact, for a while, I felt like I was one of the rarer voices forecasting an Ocarina of Time remake for Nintendo Switch's successor, and perhaps even as a cross-gen title launching on the Nintendo Switch itself. The fundamental reasons are the same as I've stated before, a combination of Eiji Aonuma's history of oblique hints that tease specific titles and now seem to be pointing towards a possible Ocarina remake, and the fact that Ocarina itself is such a huge, iconic, eye-catching title, and the 3DS remake is now older than the N64 original was at the time the 3DS game launched. Also, Zelda's 40th and the movie releases are just around the corner, at least in the time frame it takes games to be developed in, and it just makes all the sense in the world for either of those events, let alone both, to be marked by the release of a highly accessible version of possibly the franchise's most iconic game. But whether there is an Ocarina of Time remake in the works or not is not what I'm addressing here today, but rather the identity of the team who could be behind it, and here numerous options present themselves. The first option has to be an internal team. Nintendo have developed Zelda remakes internally as recently as 2012 with the Wind Waker HD port. At that point, the Zelda team were at something of an inflection point after the more muted sales response and, after the initial hype died away, muted critical reaction to Skyward Sword led them to start rethinking the conventions of the series. Working on Wind Waker for a year seemed to give them a bit of breathing room as they worked out the shape of what would become Breath of the Wild. I think a new Ocarina title would be a very different beast. A simple up-res is not going to cut it, and the kind of treatment I would expect, and what I think most Ocarina fans are dying to see, is a wowy 4K title with cinematic cutscenes and true graphical brilliance. A remake as comprehensive as Link's Awakening was, in other words, although I appreciate that for some, that game's lag and not universally beloved art style might make it a slightly controversial point of comparison. Now that does not rule out an internal team still. The way Nintendo tends to work when developing their games is that they have a small core team flesh out the fundamentals and then expand outwards once they go into full development. The kinds of people who will be working on Ocarina would be, by definition, the very people who would not be needed on the main title at this point in its development, the people working on the graphics and cinematics and sound design and so on. Historically, Nintendo has absorbed these people into other projects across Nintendo's many departments. Breath of the Wild staff were found credited on ARMS, Splatoon 2, and Ring Fit Adventure before returning to the fold when Tears of the Kingdom ramped up development. But there is no strict rule here that this has to be the case, and in some respects the direction of travel at Nintendo seems to have been towards a more siloed structure. Before the 2015 rejig of what is now the Entertainment Planning and Development Division (EPD), many of the teams had worked on many different types of games, but since the rejig, the groups appear to have a lot more focus. In the Switch era, Yoshio Sakamoto's EPD7 has been working pretty much exclusively, as far as we can tell, on 2D Metroid and Famicom Detective Club, while EPD5 has been only Splatoon and Animal Crossing focused. EPD4 has picked up the casual titles with Switch Sports, and Kensuke Tanabe's EPD6 have picked up the WarioWare series, which makes sense since EPD6 support the same team in developing the Paper Mario series as well. It's difficult to say for sure as it takes so long for games to be developed that you can only discern the patterns in retrospect, but there is some evidence to say that Nintendo are encouraging larger standing teams, and if there is ever a company that would benefit from a permanent team, it is the Zelda group. An Ocarina remake could be a chance for, say, Daiki Iwamoto to return to the director's chair, or it could be used as an opportunity for new talent to cut their teeth and take on a very large project while still having the comfort of knowing that original director Eiji Aonuma is on hand to make sure things don't get too wild. All things considered, I have to rate the likelihood of a prospective Ocarina of Time game being developed by an internal team quite highly. But before we put numbers on it, let's survey the rest of the landscape. The Zelda team has a few go-to collaborators of this kind of thing. Most notably, the developers of Ocarina 3D, Grezzo, are still working frequently with Nintendo. Although it seems likely that they're behind this year's Echoes of Wisdom, it's not necessarily the case that this game took the full 5 years since Link's Awakening to develop, and even given that they put out an original mobile title in the meantime, it is conceivable that they could be in the early stages of developing an Ocarina game, especially if it was commissioned in late 2023 or 2024 after, potentially, Echoes of Wisdom finished its development journey and was held until Nintendo got its ducks in a row in terms of an announcement. Now, there are concerns here with Grezzo potentially taking on a remake like Ocarina of Time. If we're talking about a 4K, visually titanic game, Grezzo's relatively small team might not be ideally suited. They have a secondary team that ported Miitopia, but I don't think a Miitopia-style port is going to fulfill the potential Nintendo, let alone the fans, see in a title like this. It will be a real shame for Nintendo to go to the effort of bringing Ocarina of Time back, only for fans to consider it a disappointment and lacking the ambition that the game deserves. And while Grezzo's work is generally very attractive, the slowdown on Link's Awakening may call into question their technical skills to deliver something truly cutting edge. Plus, it might feel a bit like robbing Peter to pay Paul if they cut out their 2D Zelda team at the knees to produce another 3D remake. Personally, I'm hoping Grezzo continue to plough on in the 2D space with a mix of original games and remakes, but that's not to say that they can be completely ruled out. The next potential candidate, however, is Tantalus. The Melbourne, Australia-based company recently was credited for the port of Luigi's Mansion 2 HD and have been knocking around video games for a while. I remember them doing the surprisingly excellent Wipeout port from PlayStation to Saturn back in the day, and they have helped publish other Switch titles such as Rime and Sonic Mania, but their track record with Eiji Aonuma's group includes work on both Twilight Princess HD and Skyward Sword HD. Tantalus appears to work in multiple locations across Australia, but the core team on these games seems to be in Melbourne. There was plenty of give and take in the relationship between the Melbourne team and Nintendo. Assistant Director Tomomi Sano on Twilight Princess explained, "We came to enjoy a lively exchange of opinions as we got used to the environment of working over the internet. Most of all, it was very encouraging for us that Tantalus always worked with our requests." Kiwi Talks has an interview with an environment artist for Tantalus, Emily McGregor, where she observes that they would have been happy to do a more comprehensive overhaul of Twilight Princess's graphics, but it was Nintendo that held them back. Both Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword are pretty decent looking as far as they go, but while Nintendo would spec the Twilight Princess job to have a very specific frame of reference in terms of what they could tweak and improve, the fact the team would have been extremely keen to try a more extensive visual overhaul might suggest a more ambitious project from the same group one day could be possible. Nintendo builds trust slowly over a long period of time, but build it they do all the same. And so with Tantalus having put out a Zelda title in 2016 and in 2021, could they keep up the anniversary pattern and have something for us for Zelda's 40th in 2026 that is a little bit more extensive than their previous ports? Look, anytime you have a large team, something more ambitious is possible, but Tantalus have been on the porting side for a long time, so I think there are questions to be asked about whether a much more serious commitment to remake a game is something that they would take on and that Nintendo would commission them to provide. Then again, a classic Nintendo Forecast Credits deep dive does prove rather interesting. 26 of the Twilight Princess HD staff from Tantalus made their way into the credits for Skyward Sword HD, well over half the development staff. If that team moved straight into Luigi's Mansion 2 HD, wouldn't you expect similar numbers to have made the jump, if not more, given that Luigi's Mansion 2 HD released after only a 3-year gap and not a 5-year gap? But only 10 credits are shared between Skyward Sword HD and Luigi's Mansion 2 HD, despite Luigi's Mansion 2 HD having actually slightly more people credited in total than either of these Zelda remasters. It also seems that a lot of the shared credits are either supervisory roles or roles like quality control that could apply across games. Quite different from how the Twilight Princess HD's team's core posts were more or less filled by the same people that went on to work on Skyward Sword HD. What could this mean? Probably nothing, but possibly that Tantalus are keeping their Zelda band together, in which case the likelihood of them handling something for the Zelda team increases significantly, as does the chance, trust having been built up, that it could be more ambitious than what they've worked on until this point. Of course, that does not have to mean Ocarina of Time. Arguably, Ocarina of Time isn't even the likeliest option for a company which mainlines on remasters and ports rather than full-fledged remakes. They could be helping to bring Wind Waker HD to either Switch or its successor, or even working on a 4K version of Breath of the Wild. I think there's a 70% chance we will see something Zelda-related from this Tantalus team before the end of 2027, as I really don't think they were the people tasked with this Luigi's Mansion 2 HD port, and it really does seem that they have a long-term commitment to Zelda, but I am still skeptical that it is Ocarina of Time that is the game they'll be taking on. Instead of journeying then to Australia to find support, might Nintendo find it a little closer to home? The team have partnered with Koei Tecmo twice to produce the Hyrule Warriors titles, but there is a precedent for Koei Tecmo to support core Nintendo games that they then can turn into glorious Musou action. Enter Fire Emblem Three Houses, which of course was developed with extensive help from Koei Tecmo, allowing for their hack-and-slash specialist team Amiga Force to swoop in and develop Fire Emblem Warriors Three Hopes as a consequence. It has been 3 years since we last saw a Hyrule Warriors title, soon to be 4 years, and while you'd never bet against another Musou entry, probably one tapping into Tears of the Kingdom's extensive backstory, Nintendo is never one to gild the lily by overproducing games if it doesn't need to. What if they decided that they didn't want another Hyrule Warriors just yet, but they would like to tap into the same team to work on an Ocarina of Time port, which would then be used as the template for the next Hyrule Warriors game a few years afterwards, an Ocarina of Time sequel title in the Musou engine. It is, I grant, a bit of a reach, if only because the team were kept largely separate from the main production group during the development of Age of Calamity. Apparently they had to figure out how Nintendo like Breath of the Wild. An Ocarina remake, though, would require a very different kind of working relationship, with them working hand in glove with the Nintendo developers and on a very different kind of game than they're used to. As I say, it's far from impossible, but that doesn't make it particularly likely either. Let's swing back then to internal teams and consider another group who have worked extensively on Zelda and might be ready for something a little bit more, specifically Monolith Soft. As well as being the geniuses behind the Xenoblade Chronicles titles, the company also has a regular support team working on Zelda, and the same rationale that I applied to the internal devs also applies to Monolith Soft. If the team is there, why not give them something with a bit more teeth? This would certainly be a way to reward and keep growing Monolith Soft, but while the studio is big, perhaps a full-size remake might be a little too much, when they are likely to be busy developing other graphically intensive titles, probably for the Switch successor. Still, while the next Xenoblade Chronicles title or even a new IP could be big breakout hits, we all know that it's huge selling games like Ocarina of Time that keep the lights on at Nintendo HQ most of the time. So I think there is a good reason for Nintendo to task Monolith Soft with a game like this. We've now exhausted all the obvious candidates, but that still leaves us with the non-obvious candidates. There are regular partner studios like Bandai Namco, who in a separate video I show could well have had a project or two in development for Nintendo over recent years. And of course, these things could go really wild and we could get the graphical specialists' next level games. Digital Foundry recently acclaimed Luigi's Mansion 3 as the best looking Switch title, and so if they wanted animation specialists to really take Zelda to the next level and to reward their newest studio acquisition in the process, or the newest until recently, now they've acquired Shiver, perhaps a next level games developed Ocarina of Time could be the way of the future. The same logic in fact could be applied to retro studios, given how drop-dead gorgeous the Metroid Prime remaster was and their famed capacity to make graphically beautiful titles. Still, while there is some history of remakes being sent abroad with Tantalus and at least Retro and Next Level Games will be at the same company as Nintendo, it feels to me out of keeping with the long association between these studios as Kensuke Tanabe's development teams. Nigh on everything that Retro and Next Level Games have done over the previous decades has been under the watchful eye of Kensuke Tanabe. And while that doesn't necessarily mean they won't partner with other studios going forward, Retro did have a hand in Mario Kart 7 after all, it does make that turn of events seem much less likely. Plus, with Metroid Prime 4 and almost certainly Luigi's Mansion 4 on their plates, it's likely that those teams have quite a lot to be doing already without taking on an Ocarina of Time title, which would be, I'm sure, a very large undertaking. But if not any of these studios, Nintendo would need to go further afield, and one of the brightest constellations in the sky is actually an Ember, specifically Ember Labs, who declared their Zelda fandom in a massive way by dropping their beautiful and eye-catching Zelda Majora's Mask Terrible Fate video to show their skills before releasing the acclaimed PlayStation title Kena Bridge of Sighs. Now, Nintendo can be an ornery bunch, and they might not have liked the co-founding Greer brothers leveraging Zelda's name to get attention for their product, and definitely when Nintendo do a remake, they usually like to do it in a way that nobody expects. Don't be completely astonished if Ocarina this time is in claymation. Still, it can work the other way too. Mercury Steam were big fans of Metroid and pitched the company and then ended up making it. It's not impossible that the fandom could work to their advantage, especially when Ember Labs has one acclaimed title under its belt already. This might seem like a long shot, and it is, so let's dive into Game Industry Biz's 2023 interview with the Ember Labs founding brothers, who quote them as saying, "I guess you can call us aging gamers, people who have less time to play things, so things that are more approachable from a scope perspective are always more appealing to us. We'll try to do something a little bit more ambitious as we grow, but we're still trying to be conscious of making something that's digestible and something that we want to play as gamers right now in our current pace of life with kids and stuff," which suggests a smaller game, but equally, who doesn't want to play their childhood favourites with their kids? And then there remains the option of Nintendo to surprise and delight us completely with some new partnership we haven't dreamed of yet. I remember only too well when Ocarina was released. At that time I was a Sega Saturn owner, and while I will never lose my love for that system, which at the time was letting me enjoy forever favourites like Panzer Dragoon Saga and Shining Force 3, Ocarina of Time was one of those games that grabbed my attention to the point where I remember literally dreaming about it. I'm sure there are many devs out there who dream of Ocarina, and in that sense, if Nintendo wanted to find and assemble an absolute A-team on the development front, I'm sure they could easily find a lot of willing collaborators. I do think therefore that the field is very open between internal teams, which would include Monolith Soft, and external teams including Grezzo and Tantalus. The logic to me dictates an internal team based on the reasons I've outlined, but the practicalities of finding a large internal team at a time when Nintendo are trying to focus all their attention on getting new games for the new system may mitigate against it. At this point, and barring any further evidence, I'm forecasting that if there is an Ocarina of Time remake by 2027, there's a 50% chance that it is an internal team, including Monolith Soft, a 30% chance it is Tantalus, and a 10% chance that it is Grezzo. Of course, all these presuppose that the Ocarina of Time remake exists at all, and if you want more of my Zelda forecast, I suggest this playlist on screen, which has you covered. Please like, subscribe, pop by the Patreon if you enjoyed this video to support the channel, but otherwise have a superb day and I will see you soon for another Nintendo forecast.